Oh, good evening, everyone. My name is John Highbush, and I have the great honor of being the executive director of the Reagan Foundation and Institute. I just want to thank everyone for coming here this evening. In honor of our men and women in uniform who protect our freedom around the world, if you please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. In preparing for tonight's introduction of our special guest, I came across a number of sources that state that Lee Edwards is, quote, the preeminent historian of the conservative movement, close quote. Now, how is that? Well, because since committing his life to pro-freedom and anti-communist efforts as a young man back as far as 1956, he has been present at nearly every major event of the modern conservative movement. I was thinking about it just like the character Forrest Gump, played by Tom Hanks in the movie by that name. Dr. Edwards has indeed been on the scene for just about every key moment of the conservative revolution. So while I fully agree with the claim, I consulted the internet, of course, and searched for the term modern conservative movement to see how the idea of modern is defined as it relates to conservatism. And the very first item that popped up in my search was an article entitled, quote, The Origins of the Modern American Conservative Movement by, well, you may have guessed, by Lee Edwards. So I know that the folklore must be true. But speaking of anti-communist efforts and the conservative movement, it was 30 years ago to this very day that President Reagan delivered a radio address notifying Americans that a treaty to eliminate an entire class of U.S. and Soviet intermediate range missiles was close to completion. This radio address came just 4 months after President Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate and demanded that the Berlin Wall come down. In 2009, Lee was kind enough to be here as we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the day the Berlin Wall fell. He sat on a panel that discussed worldwide perspectives on the fall of the wall and on what its end meant for nations on both sides of the old divide. Lee is the author, at last count, of over 25 books, I think. And he truly has chronicled countless major events in the conservative movement over the years. He ran national publicity for Barry Goldwater's campaign. He organized the largest public demonstration in support of our men and women in Vietnam. He engaged in 50 years of correspondence with William F. Buckley Jr. He has written one of the most authoritative biographies on Ronald Reagan ever produced. He was the initial editor of the Conservative Digest. Finally, I know that from experience, he has served as a distinguished fellow alongside the great Ed Feulner at the Heritage Foundation when Ronald Reagan first went to Washington, D.C., and there is so very much more. In a November 2016 article with the Daily Caller, he said he has no intention of retiring. So while he's here tonight to share some insight into the past 60 years, we hope we'll continue to hear from him for many, many more years to come. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a conversation with Dr. Lee Edwards.
Well, I'm still blushing. Oh my goodness.
Well, Lee is so studied on so many topics. He could give a speech here on any number of them for, an hour. But we thought it'd be entertaining and interesting for me to ask Lee several questions about his life, about his most recent memoir that's come out, and then open it up to the floor for you all to ask questions. And I would just ask that when I do that, if you raise your hand, just wait to ask the question. We want to put a microphone in your hand because when you do ask your question, you're going to be on TV, and we're broadcasting this on the internet, so we want to make sure that Lee can hear your question, and so can those who are watching all around the world. So, Lee, just absolutely terrific to have you. Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much, John.
What I know you from, Lee, is as a young staffer on Capitol Hill during the Reagan years. I think at that time, or thereabouts, you were already affiliated with the Heritage Foundation, which made such a difference in the Reagan administration. I remember at the time Heritage had produced a mandate for leadership.
Yes.
And everyone in the Reagan administration looked at it like a Bible. So I just wonder if you could talk to me about that time frame and about the introduction of all that in the Reagan years.
Right. Well, I think that's a very appropriate thing to do because in 2 years before the election, this would have been 79, year and a half, there was a meeting of the board of the Heritage Foundation, and they said, well, now, we think that we ought to have some kind of a guidebook, of a primer, of a list of things that ought to be done by a conservative administration. Now, this is 79. This is even before Ronald Reagan had announced, before he had won the nomination, before he'd won the election. And yet, these very wise trustees of the Heritage Foundation said, let's do it. Let's do it. And who knows? We think he's got a very good chance, Ronald Reagan. We hope he's going to win. But let's go ahead and do it. This was an extraordinary gamble. And what they did was to bring together 250 conservative academics, experts, people from Capitol Hill and so forth, looking at every aspect of an administration and making specific recommendations as to what ought to be done, up to staffing, up to there should be a tax cut, this mandate said, of 30%, which is what Reagan asked for, and on and on and on. And so Heritage worked throughout this year, 1980, somewhat relieved, as you might imagine, when he won the nomination. Oh, this is getting closer and closer. And then, of course, he was running against Jimmy Carter. And it was not a sure thing, not a sure thing. Mr. Carter was not the most successful president we've ever had, certainly. But would he be able to, for example, to bring back all the hostages from Tehran? Didn't know. And yet, at the final counting, Ronald Reagan won the election. So what did Heritage do? They had produced a 1,000-page document. It was 1,000 pages, called Mandate for Leadership. And they presented that to the top staffers for Mr. Reagan, including Ed Meese and Marty Anderson and Dick Allen and others as well. And the president-elect took it upon himself. I'm not saying that he read every last page, but we do know that he went through and did some skimming and some scanning and saying, this is really, really solid stuff that we can use in the administration. At the first cabinet meeting, he decided that he was going to mention this. And so he took, let me borrow your book, and he took this and put it on the seat of every chair of every member of the cabinet. So when they came in for the first cabinet meeting, they couldn't sit down. But, oh, well, what is this? And here was the mandate for leadership. And the president said, gentlemen and lady, because Jeane Kirkpatrick was a member of the cabinet, I like this mandate very much. Please use it in your endeavors in your particular department. So that was something which we never have forgotten at the Heritage Foundation. And neither, I mean, we figured out that about 60% of the 2,000, there were 2,000 recommendations in this book, that 60% of them were adopted in part or in whole by the Reagan administration over the next 8 years.
Yeah, in fact, I'm certain President Reagan didn't put it on the seats of members of Congress and the Senate, but they certainly found a way to ensure that Heritage got the copy to every member on Capitol
Yes.
Hill, because it sat on my desk. And, so it acted as a
Right.
blueprint
Right.
for people in Congress that were behind the president during that revolution as well. So tell me, for you, Lee, where do you think it all started? I know that your memoir talks about there are 60 years of experience with you in the conservative movement. Where was your baptism? How did you become a conservative? And was there a particular moment in time?
Well, actually, it was something which happened in Paris. I was a student in Paris in 1956, and all of a sudden, we got these radio broadcasts from Budapest. And the young Hungarians were revolting against the Soviet oppressors there. And I was just practically, dancing on the ceiling. It was so great. And that these young men and women of Hungary in 1956 were throwing off the Soviet yoke. And there was a period there of about 2 weeks in which there was freedom once again in Hungary. And then the Soviet tanks came in, the Soviet troops came in, they killed thousands, sent hundreds of thousands of Hungarians fleeing from their country. And I waited for someone on our side to do something beyond just a resolution or a statement from the White House. And it didn't come. It didn't come. And I felt so embarrassed. And even beyond that, I was angry that more was not done to help these brave freedom fighters there in Budapest. And I resolved at that moment that I would do whatever I could for the rest of my life to support those and help those who were resisting communism and who were supporting and defending liberty.
I know that you cover this period in your memoir, Just Right. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to pick it up yet. It's for sale here, and I think that Lee's going to be able to sign it for a number of people, but I had the chance to go through it, and it covers, this is truly your memoir, Lee, right? It covers your experience in the movement,
Right.
your entire life, right? And I think the title, Just Right, it's nice. It fits in.
Not too hot, not too cold.
Just right, and to the right. But this, for those of you here, it's a special moment because this book was just truly hot off the presses. This is the very first, this is the coming out party for the book with Lee.
This is the first public event we've had for the book. And what better place to do it than this fantastic.
Right, and I think from here he heads to the Nixon Library, and I think on Sunday Lee just learned that he'll be on C-SPAN or with Brian Lamb to talk about the book. So I'm sure this is going to get a lot of circulation. So congratulations to you on that, Lee. I've thought of you since I've known you for several years. And I want you to tell me if you think this is a fair or not a fair description of you, but I've kind of thought of you as the scribe of the conservative movement and the conservative revolution in America in the past half century. Is that a fair characterization of you?
Well, actually, I've led two lives. I was a political activist for the first 30 or 40 years or so. And that's where I was working for Barry Goldwater in his campaign. I was just a private, not high up, in Mr. Reagan's attempt in 1968 in Miami, and again in 1976 in Kansas City, and others as well. Bill Buckley was a very important person in my life as well, and we worked together on a number of anti-communist projects. So I felt that was what I was going to do for the rest of my life. But after about 20-some years of doing it and working in campaigns and politics and government and so forth, frankly, I was burned out. I was tired. And I really wanted to do what I've been thinking about doing for some time, and that was to go back to school and then to be able to teach and to write. And so that's what I've done the last 30-some years as well. So I've been very fortunate. I've had 2 great careers, and all of them centered on, though, conservatism.
Right. Talk to us about Barry Goldwater. This is the house that Ronald Reagan built, but a lot of people, myself included, feel like if there was no Barry Goldwater, there might not have been a Ronald Reagan. And tell us a little bit about your experience with the Goldwater and that campaign.
Right. Well, Barry Goldwater, I call him the most consequential loser in politics, the most consequential loser. And he lost. He lost big time in 1964. He only carried 6 states, only got about 38.5% of the popular vote. And his treasurer, a man named Bill Mittendorf, and Ambassador Mittendorf, called it a glorious disaster. That's what he called the campaign. But he, at the same time, was so consequential in so many ways. For example, that of those 6 states that he carried, 5 were in the Deep South. And so Barry Goldwater broke the Democrats' solid hold on the solid South for the first time. He raised certain issues courageously that no one had dared raise before. He talked about Social Security. He talked about taxes. He said there should be a flat tax, and people were just aghast at that idea. He said we shouldn't have as many government subsidies as we have. Let's do away with subsidies, including farm subsidies. And he said that to about 100,000 farmers at the plow contest out in South Dakota. And they weren't too happy about that. He inspired young people like myself because he was just so pure. Things were black and white with Barry Goldwater. And he inspired us with that being so totally committed to conservative ideas and trying to implement it. And maybe the most important thing, one of the most important things he did was to provide Ronald Reagan with an opportunity to make the famous A Time for Choosing. And I happened to be there when this came about. The high command of the Goldwater campaign didn't want to do the film, didn't want to do the speech by Ronald Reagan. Why? Well, they said, our candidate is Barry Goldwater, not Ronald Reagan. And, but he talks about Barry Goldwater. No, we know that, and also he talks about Social Security and A Time for Choosing, and that just raises this issue again. So we want to run a film of Goldwater and Eisenhower at Gettysburg, which they'd already run once before. And the only problem was that the people who'd put up the money for this telecast weren't interested in putting up the money for anything but Ronald Reagan. And Barry Goldwater called Ronald Reagan on the phone with a day before it was supposed to go on. He said, Ronnie, there's some really problems with this thing. Well, Mr. Reagan said, people like it, been very enthusiastic. They've been applauding it. I've been giving this speech all over California. Have you heard it or seen it? And he said, well, actually, I haven't. Oh. Well, he said, I'll take a look at it and I'll get back to you. So they played an audio version of A Time for Choosing for Barry Goldwater. This is 1 week before Election Day. And Goldwater listened to it, looked up and said, well, what the hell's wrong with that? It's good, run it. And he gave his permission. And that telecast was the making of Ronald Reagan as a political star. I mean, he'd been famous in Hollywood, on television, with the GE Theater and so forth. But that made him, overnight, a force to be reckoned with in politics, in American politics. And Henry Salvatore and others came to him, Ronald Reagan, the following year, and said, we want you to run for governor. And they were very plain in saying that one of the reasons is because of this Time for Choosing.
Yeah, in fact, Lee, I was fortunate when Mrs. Reagan was alive, and we had just finished the renovations of the new exhibits that are here, and I had a chance to walk through with her at each exhibit and stop along the way, and we have an exhibit here of the video of President Reagan in the famous Time for Choosing speech, and you're able to push a button and pick a segment or a clip and watch the video of the famous speech. And I was showing it to her, and she recounted the story for me of exactly the moment that you're talking about when Goldwater called President Reagan and changed his mind or changed his senior staff's mind.
Right.
And
right.
gave
Overruled
President Reagan,
yeah.
She said President Reagan was in his bathrobe. He had just finished shaving. He was just ready and raring to go to give the speech. And when he got the go-ahead from Goldwater, it just changed his life, just like you said.
You know, it's, I'm still teaching at Catholic University. This is my 30th year as an adjunct professor there. And I always really urge my students, John, to watch A Time for Choosing. I think that it's our Gettysburg Address. Truly.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
It's that good. I mean, it's in terms of its content, in terms of its delivery, in terms of its timing. I mean, this is a piece of unprecedented, I think, political oratory.
That's right. And I as you watch President Reagan give those remarks, as you can see, I think he has some note cards or what have you on the dais in front of him. But boy, he had given that speech in various forms over and
Right.
over and over,
Right.
so that by the time he got to that audience in that commercial, he knew it by heart, and it just was masterfully delivered, I think you'd say, right?
Yes, absolutely. And this is with 1 week to go, and sort of $1 million came pouring into the National Goldwater Committee within 24 hours. I mean, people were just saying, we want copies of this. We want to run it to the Kiwanis and the American Legion and all our church groups and so forth.
That's right.
And that happened.
Yeah.
So it shifted thousands and thousands of votes. So I think you can say, you know, no candidate Goldwater, no President Reagan, because nobody else would have given or allowed that telecast to be broadcast.
That's right. Lee, you, amongst your 25 books, we have one that's, I think it's on sale here at our store, and in my opinion, it's absolutely one of the best books on President Reagan. And for those in the audience, Lee's book is called The Essential Ronald Reagan, and that's a good title for it. It's a profile in courage, justice, and wisdom. I had the chance to read it, and it taught me a lot about President Reagan. And I wonder, is there a story that, whether it's in this book or not, on President Reagan that you think's most instructive or most revealing to our audience about the man and who he was?
Well, I would go back to the fall of 1965. And I had been given an opportunity by the editor of the Washington editor of the Reader's Digest to do a profile of Mr. Reagan. So I came out to California with my wife Ann, who is my colleague and co-editor and co-author in so much of what I do. So the two of us were given an opportunity to travel with Ronald Reagan for 2 days. For 2 days. This was in October of 1965, and he was just wrapping up and thinking, I think, yeah, I'm going to run for governor. He'd been on the road for several months. But we had an opportunity, and we spent these 2 days with him. My wife, Ann, was very knowledgeable about politics, been active in New York City, and knew her politicians and her politics. And it was amazing to us. He would speak to young people, would speak to business people, he would speak to women, he would speak to a whole variety of different people in these 2 particular days. And you could see people reacting to them of all backgrounds and all interests and all professions. I mean, there was this aura about him of the star. And at the end of the 2 days, I wrote in my notebook, because I was taking notes all the time, of course, for this piece, President Reagan, question mark. And when I wrote my first biography of him, which came out in 1967, I took out the question mark. Took him out. I have no question. At the end of that day, second day, he said, "We've been working really hard, Lee. Come on up to the house, have some iced tea and cookies." So he went up Pacific Palisades to his home there. And Nancy and he went into the kitchen to do the iced tea. And we were sitting in the library and the den. And there were shelves and shelves of books. So, of course, immediately, John, I went over and began saying, "Well, what are the titles?" And I was astounded. They were history, politics, economics, serious works, including, and I mentioned these 4 classics, The Road to Serfdom by Hayek, F.A. Hayek, Nobel laureate, Witness by Whittaker Chambers, Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, and a book I had never read by Frederick Bastiat, The Law. And he was a 19th century economist, free enterprise economist. And then I said, well, maybe they're not real, you know. So I went over and began taking the books out of the shelves. And Anna's, don't do that. And Nancy may come in or something like, no. And I said, no, I want to see. And I opened up the book, underlined, annotated. I won't say every one, page out, but there was, or dog-eared. He had read these books. He had annotated these books. He had learned from these books. And he had arrived at his conservatism, at his philosophy, the old-fashioned way, one book at a time. And so to my mind, and I've said this and I've been challenged up, and I think it's true, Ronald Reagan was an intellectual. I mean, he's many things, as we all know, but he was an intellectual, which is to say, he is somebody who was interested in ideas, was comfortable with ideas, and knew the power of ideas.
Yeah, it's funny you'd say that because, well, I've been in this job over 7 years, and when I was interviewed for the job, I interviewed with numerous members of the Board of Trustees, and the last stop on the line was with someone named Nancy Reagan, and obviously a trustee of the foundation, and I went to their home in Bel Air. Now, by this time, they had moved from Palisades to Bel Air, and walked in, and she was on a couch, and guess what was behind her? An enormous library of those very same books. I didn't look for those 4 titles, but I'm certain they were there. And I thought how valuable, what a collection. And I just knew at the outset that you could tell President Reagan indeed was a real intellectual. He was so well read. And evidence of that, as you know, Lee, is the many, many Saturday morning radio speeches that he gave prior to this presidency. He wrote in longhand on every single policy matter you could imagine, straight out of President Reagan's mind. So I think you're absolutely right about that. And other evidence of that is all the collection of the many, many quotes that we have here that we found after he had passed away, that he hid in his desk, that he had collected over 40 years of some of the best minds in the country and around the world. So it's as a historian that you are, it's great to hear you give those stories.
Particularly when he had read books I had not read.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's right. I think he also, would you agree, the GE years were very
Yes,
important to him.
yes,
As it,
yeah.
I don't know how much he read on those train rides, but I know that he got incredible practice speaking in front of groups, and maybe that's where he developed his chops as a terrific communicator.
Well, I can tell you that he did read on those trips. This is a period from 54 to 62. He was doing the GE Theater Sunday night, very popular show, half hour long, doing various dramas, comedies, and so forth, some of which he starred in, by the way. And I interviewed Earl Dunkel, who was the escort officer from General Electric for the first 2 years. And they would get on the train, because he didn't fly in those days, and he would get on the train and going on to Chicago or San Antonio or New York or wherever it was, where the GE factory was, because he visited all 125 General Electric factories during this period. And he would show up with his arms full of books or magazines or newspapers. And along the way, and they'd be on the road together, he would always be picking up the latest newspaper, and he'd be going through it and underlining it, and this is a good quote, I think I'll use that, and so forth. I mean, the man's curiosity was just, I would say, almost say, insatiable.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. With that, I'd like to have you ask questions.
Please.
Lee's got such an incredible history, and you should feel free to ask him about any topic in the last 60 years. I'll bet you he'll have an answer. So with that,
Don't ask me about the liberals, though.
if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and we'll put a microphone in front of you and go from there. Yes, right over here. And then we'll get to you, sir.
Who were Barry Goldwater's influences intellectually?
Goldwater was a college dropout. Never got, he went freshman year and that was it, because his father died and he had to go into the business. He was more someone who got his information and his ideas orally, not so much from the printed word. And so there were particularly histories about the West, which he was particularly interested in. But I can tell you one book that he did read, which was really important. I mentioned it, the book A Road to Serfdom by Hayek. The Reader's Digest did a digest of that book in 1945. And I found out later, through interviews, that a Hollywood actor coming out of World War II and wondering what his future was going to be, and an Arizona businessman coming out of Phoenix and wondering what his future was going to be, both had read The Road to Serfdom, both of them. And they both told me what an influence that book. This is a book about free enterprise, about individual initiative, about individual responsibility, and a role for limited government, under London, limited, not great. So Goldwater was comfortable with talking about ideas and talking with intellectuals, but was not a great reader himself.
Right. Right over here. Right.
Yeah, looking toward the future of conservative thought in the Republican Party, in the Los Angeles Times today, there was an op-ed piece by Jonah Goldberg, and he referenced the fact that there was a time when William F. Buckley and Barry Goldwater read crackpots like the John Birch Society out of the conservative movement. And Goldberg feels that essentially today that's what conservatives need to do with your alt-right types like Steve Bannon and this character Moore, who just won the senatorial primary in Alabama, even though he's been a disgraced judge 2 times. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I think you have to be careful about how you characterize people. If you're talking about somebody who is pro-Nazi, obviously you don't want to associate with him. If you're talking about somebody who is an out-and-out racist, you don't want to be associated. If you're talking about somebody who's an out-and-out anti-Semite, you don't want to be associated with him or listen to him or give him any kind of place in the discussion. But I think somebody who perhaps like Mr. Bannon, I don't know him, I never have met him, I've not studied him seriously, but some of his ideas do make some sense. I mean, they do carry some weight. And I don't say this just because Mr. Trump has endorsed them, but in and of themselves. So I think you have to be very careful in defining yourself as to who you're going to include and not to include. In terms of the future, here's my take on it, and I wrote a piece about this. I think we need a new fusionism, And this was something which, going back to the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, bringing together traditional conservatives, libertarians, and anti-communists. Those are the three strains of the conservative movement back at that time, in the 60s and the 70s. They came together, and they worked together because of the leadership of people like Bill Buckley and Ronald Reagan. And because, frankly, there was an external threat, the Soviet Union, and there was an internal threat, and that was socialism. And so they were able to keep them together. It seems to me that what we need today is a new fusion to bring together all the various strains of conservatism. And not just 3 these days. There are about 10 different kinds. But I think the only way to rationalize them and to bring them together is to have them talk to each other, is to have them debate each other, and not to dismiss them out of hand. So I think we have to be very, very careful about that and be as broad and as reasonable as we can be, but still keeping out the kooks, keeping out those who are obviously beyond the pale and should not be included.
Yes, sir. And then we'll go to the back. We'll start up front, and then we'll.
You know, I always wonder about this kind of hard split between my team, right or wrong, whether you're Republican or Democrat or whatever. And I always feel that I sat at the moment when that may have happened, and remember back in high school that you were either pro-Vietnam or you were not, you either were or were not, and there was no compromise at all. And I just see that split widening and widening to what's happening now. Was there a pivotal moment that you might imagine, which is when that split, that fractionation of American public actually started and then never was ever able to get back again?
Well, I think it was the 60s, which was a decade of chaos in so many ways. And it really split so many people who are feeling that we shouldn't be in the war under any circumstances, who felt that certain people's rights were not being respected. And that, of course, came out of that was the civil rights movement. And there were people in the Deep South and Mississippi and Alabama who weren't very happy about that. So I think it started in the 1960s. But in terms of bringing people together, I think the reason why the conservative movement is split is because we don't have two things. We don't have the external threat that we had at that time. The fact that the Berlin Wall came down, the fact that the Soviet Union dissolved, so that external threat was no longer there to make people come together and work together. Today, I think myself, because I'm from the East, and I drove by the Pentagon the day that it was bombed in 9/11, and I'll never forget that. That's why I wear this flag. They are a threat. They haven't gone away. The radical jihadists have not gone away. They're there. And there are a lot of potential threats and a lot of potential acts of violence against all of us, which have not occurred through the efforts of our military and our civilian forces here in this country. Heritage has done some study on this. About 80, 90 some possible terrorist attacks have been prevented by actions taken by the FBI or by the military and everything like that. So to my mind, that still is a threat. Then I think here at home, it's socialism, really. When I talk to my students about socialism, they're saying, well, you know, Mr. Sanders thinks that's a pretty good idea, and I'm having to debate with them to make them understand what they're going to lose if we have socialism come to this country. So it seems to me the other thing that we don't have is the right kind of charismatic leadership. No, we don't have a Bill Buckley. We don't have a Ronald Reagan. And until we have someone like that, this may be something which maybe I'm putting too much pressure on him, but you know, we're selecting a new president at the Heritage Foundation. That's going on right now, and that's going to be announced any day. I'm hopeful that that president, whoever he or she is, can provide that kind of leadership. And one of the first things I hope he does, or she does, is to bring together representatives of all these various different, the neocons and the paleocons and all the rest of them, the reformicons and so forth. And let's talk out what we agree on, and let's try to work together to save this country. Because I think it's going in a precariously condition right now.
Well put. There's one here in the back, I think, and then we'll come to you.
When you initially met President Reagan, did he have those initial thoughts about communism, about his thoughts about it, or it only came later when events happened? And did the Heritage Foundation in their work help him?
Well, he had a personal experience with communism in the post-World War II period, when the communists were trying to take over the trade unions of Hollywood. And he was with the Screen Actors Guild, and there were other guilds dealing with people behind the cameras, working, as I say, in the trade unions there. And all of a sudden, one day, he encountered some communists who were trying to force him to take a position he didn't want to take. And so he had a personal experience with the communists in Hollywood there. Following that, as he began realizing, well, what's going on here? What are these people all about? He began reading, he began studying. So by the time that we came along, which is 1980 with the Mandate for Leadership, this was somebody who could teach us something about communism himself. He understood that it was a clear and present danger to America. And with that, he undertook some remarkable campaigns against it. And for that, we should be very, very grateful, including this, what you talked about, the INF Treaty. That was extraordinary. First time a whole category of nuclear weapons was just taken off the board, just done away with. Nobody had ever done that before. And that was because Ronald Reagan said, we're going to get rid of these, and he stuck to it. And the bargaining chip which he used, as you know, John, was SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Because Gorbachev wanted so desperately to get rid of that, and Ronald Reagan would not let it go. Finally, Mr. Gorbachev realized he was going to have to give in to the superior bargaining skills of Ronald Reagan.
Yep. I think there's a question here.
Doctor, you mentioned that, and you had to debate some of your own students regarding socialism. So my question is, how can conservatives stop and even reverse the tidal wave of progressive propaganda in our colleges, our high schools, and now even in our grammar schools?
I know it's so easy to get discouraged. I know that it's so easy to think, is it too late? But I'm here to tell you that it is possible, and that there are a lot of people like me who are adjunct professors or full-time professors who are working to bring the truth to their students about socialism, about communism. I just happen to know because I've met them, and there are organizations out there, youth organizations, which are doing it the same way, whether it's Young Americans for Freedom, or whether it's the Leadership Institute, or whether it's the Fund for American Studies, or whether it's the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. I mean, these are 4 youth groups that are impacting right now thousands of young people every day, every year. And so a lot is going on. It's not going to be turned around, but I'm looking forward to, again, leadership coming forward and being able to take that lead on making people understand what socialism is all about. And it's not the easy way that so many people think it is in trying to promote it.
Lee just mentioned of the 4 groups advocating conservatism and with youth, one of them being the Fund for American Studies. The Reagan Foundation is actually bringing Ronald Reagan back to Washington, D.C. in a way, in that we opened offices there, and we're going to be purchasing a building soon. And we work with the Fund for American Studies to offer a college course. It's an accredited college course on leadership in the American presidency, where we use President Reagan as a role model for how to make decisions. And this past summer, we had 60 kids in our class, and they're some of the brightest young minds in America. It's only 60 per semester, but they're making a magnificent difference as they go back to their colleges and their universities, following their internships in Washington. And so we're very activist in trying to make a difference in the kind of thing you're talking about, Lee, and with respect to your question.
Let me just add one more thing. There's an organization out in Ohio, the Ashbrook Center. And 10 years ago, they decided that what they were going to do was to teach high school teachers about the Constitution and the Declaration. And they began 10 years ago, and they have now, I believe it's something like 10,000 high school teachers have come through their program, which is a good week or 10 days long, and they follow up with literature and so forth. And just think about the impact of that. Now, you probably won't read about it on CNN or MSNBC, but it's happening. It's happening. And so there are groups out there that are saying we're not going to give up, because this system of ours is just the greatest system in the world, in the history of mankind. We have more freedom, more prosperity, more opportunity than any other country has ever had. And we're not going to certainly give that up to some people with half-baked ideas about socialism.
Yeah.
Sorry, getting a little...
Well put. In fact, here at the Reagan Library, we're one of those centers, and every year we teach and train thousands of teachers on civics, and we develop civics education courses and offer them to schools throughout the United States vis-a-vis the internet. And so Reagan Foundation is trying to do exactly the kinds of things that you're talking about, Lee. So great question. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, right here.
Oh, thank you. I was wondering if you could give me some insight. I have 10 grandchildren, and I am trying to teach them a little bit about all the things that I've learned being at the library here as a volunteer and studying to be a docent. And so I was wondering if you have, I know that President Reagan met Mr. Trump at one point, and there was a picture of them taken together. So he said on one of his notes, I think, that president, and I was wondering if you had any insight as to how Reagan felt about Mr. Trump at the time, and maybe some things that I might be able to tell my children, my grandchildren, to help them out in this difficult time.
Well, I'm not aware of that particular meeting, of that. I would say this about Mr. Trump, and you know, I work in Washington, D.C. I have my whole life since I was 2 years old. So there I am, politics and government. So I can't get away from it. I don't want to get away from it. he is unlike any other president that I have ever seen or watched or written about. And I think it's somebody said the other day that he's a two-track president. He's a two-track president. So maybe this will be helpful to you, two-track president. One track is what he does. Things like the Supreme Court nomination of Mr. Gorsuch, which was a home run for I think, for conservatives. The deregulation which is going on, he's thrown out the window and dozens of regulations which were put in through executive order by Mr. Obama, and some of them are very significant. He has taken, I think, a strong and principled stand in our foreign policy, and I think that's to the good, whether it's North Korea or China and other potential adversaries. The other track, of course, is the tweet track. And if you get caught up and only listening to what the latest tweet is, I think you go crazy. I really do. And of course, those who can't stand the idea of Mr. Trump as our president accentuate the one track, and you don't hear much about the other track. So I think it's a question of seeking balance. You don't necessarily forgive him for some of these things that he says, which are frankly silly, some of them, no question about it. But on the other hand, you cannot ignore the very good things which he has done, and where he is trying to be faithful as best he can to the promises he made during the campaign. And after all, I believe it was 61 million people voted for him. And don't they have a right to have a voice and a representative? So it's a question of balance there.
Well put. Other questions? Well, with that,
Can I tell my Reagan story?
oh, please.
My favorite Reagan story.
We'll end it with a Reagan story.
Tell my Reagan story. So, it's 1981, the late in the year. That terrible attempted assassination took place in March. I had revised and updated a biography of him, and I wanted to give him a copy. Could I borrow your book again? Or a book, okay. So and had a last chapter about the attempted assassination. And so my publisher had at the bottom here, in black lettering on a bright yellow, complete through the assassination attempt. Complete through the assassination attempt. I said, oh, I don't like that. You know, it's tacky, it's taking advantage of the plea. They said, no, we insist it's going to be good for sales. You must go along with us on this. So they really came, banged away, and then finally said, okay, all right, I'll do it. I don't like it, but I'll do it. So I called Mike Deaver. I said, I'd like to present a copy of the book, and he said, I think we can work that out. There was the Oval Office. There was the president with this great, big, wonderful smile, and which is on the cover of my book, Just Right. And I have presented him with the copy of the biography, which has complete through the assassination attempt. So he looks down at it, raises his head, gets that wonderful smile. He says, well, Lee, I'm sorry I messed up your ending. Only Ronald Reagan can make a joke out of an attempted assassination.
Oh, boy. Well, a great way to end. Yeah, well done.
Thank you.
Lee, thanks so much for coming
Thank
on
you.
behalf of everyone here.